Hey everybody, it's David Ariev here again for eyedesyn.com. Today we're going to be learning two of my favorite tools inside of Octane, which are Scatter and Volumetrics. Scatter allows you to create millions of instances and crazy complex geometry, and Volumetrics are things like clouds and fog for those hazy, moody looks. Let's check it out. Alright, and this is more of the look we're actually going to be creating today. This was for Victoria Modesta content for my buddy Frederic Duquette, who is directing the visuals of the show. And this is just Octane Scatter, basically scattering all these buildings onto a plane, and then I'm using the environment fog to create this really interesting looking haze. And then here, this is kind of an Inception-y look where I'm just using a bend deformer to bend the plane, but all of that stuff comes with it, so it kind of looks cool. You can see those greebly textures that we generated last time with displacement, and then this one, it's all just kind of cloned onto the inside of a sphere. But again, you can see that depth fog. And then this, I like the colors in this, but I kind of hate how glitchy these buildings get. They start popping around. But this will actually show you that it's possible to animate the noise that's cloning all of these things onto the planes. It's just that when you actually bend these planes, it starts to get all jacked up. Okay, so I'm going to fire this off into Octane. I've just got this little demo set up, and what's going on is I've got 10,000 instances of these 6 different asteroids in a cloner, and the cloner is cloned onto this big torus ring to create this asteroid belt. And as you can see, it's taking its sweet time to load into Octane. There it goes. So the point of this is just to say there's a much less painful way to do this. So I'm just going to cut off this cloner, and I've got the exact same setup here sitting in Octane Scatter. So if we look, I've got the scatter set to surface distribution on the torus, just like this cloner is set to object mode, and the object that it's cloning onto is this torus. So I'll go up to scatter, I'll cut this on. Again, it's got those 6 instances, and you'll notice that here we just get these little confetti looking things, which actually really speeds up the viewport, so the viewport doesn't choke on all the millions of instances that you can pipe into this. So right now I've just got, 10,000, and I can look around and everything's live, but let's go up to 100,000. Just add ourselves a 0 here. Okay, cool. Now I've got 100,000 instances, and I can still move around and check out all this craziness and no problem. So let's just go totally insane and add yet another 0 and go up to 1,000,000. And this will take a little bit longer, but hopefully in just a second you'll be able to see. There we go. Now this is going to take longer to render because all these bounces and all this madness is being calculated, but you can see I'm still live here, and if I kind of pull way out, it starts to look even crazier, like this, almost like this fuzzy like ring, almost like how you'd expect an actual planetary ring to look. Alright, so to be able to create this look for you guys, I'm going to have to start with some buildings, and since I suck at modeling, I'm going to reach for a pack. There's this kit bash pack called Megastructures by this artist named Vitaly Bulgarov. So let me go over here and I'll show that to you. So it's $96, but these are some of the best models out there for these futuristic cities. And this guy is just a god at hard surface modeling, so definitely check his stuff out. So if you want to do this for free and still follow along, I would use Video Copilot's free Future City pack here, and at one point he crowdsourced everyone to like create their own building and then combine them into this big pack and released it for free. So that was super cool. And when you download these are not just for Element 3D, they're also OBJs, so you can bring those OBJs into Cinema and have yourself a future city party. Okay, so when I open up Megastructures, it's just this FBX, and it loads all the geometry into Cinema like this, all in one scene, and so you can go around and look at all these cool buildings and figure out what you want to use. But the thing you're going to want to do first is make sure that each of these is merged down into a single object. For instance, here, this is its own piece, and we want to kind of collect the buildings into one, and then also reposition the axis to be at the bottom of the building so that when all of these are scattered onto geometry, they're not cut off halfway. And the easiest way I find to select a building that you want is, so you can paint kind of a selection here. So you can just click and hold, grab all of these, and then I've got this free plugin from Nitro4d called Magic Solo that if I click it, it'll just show me that, and it'll automatically do all the layers and stuff, which just makes things really easy. And then from there, I would want to right click and then connect objects and delete. And I've got a shortcut for that. For me, it's Control Backspace. So there I've got my single merged building, and then I'll want to come up to my axis center dialog here, and I want to set the Y all the way down to the bottom, and then I'll just hit execute and it'll pop down to the bottom here. So I'll go ahead and do this for several buildings that I like the look of, and then we can get into Octane. Alright, so these are the buildings I went with, including some little scaffold structures, and I fired this up into Octane, and I'm going to drop in a texture environment. So you would go under Objects, Texture Environment, which just loads an RGB spectrum into the texture channel here, and then I can just come in here and change this to something darker, so maybe around there, and immediately you can see that there is some jacked up looking geometry, and normally you'd think this is overlapping polygons or something crazy, but if I open up settings here, and I've just got it kind of undocked so you can watch this as I mess with settings, there's this setting called Ray Epsilon, and I learned this from a live stream from Ash Thorpe and Raphael Rao, and this essentially has to do with the scene scale, and I won't get too technical about it, but if I up this just a little bit, it fixes all of those errors. So if you have that issue, then this is the fix. Cool, so I've got my buildings here, and I'm just going to drop in an Octane Scatter, and again, you can get to that under Objects, Octane Scatter. It's just like a Cinema4d cloner, so if I take all of these and put them under the Octane Scatter, that will clone them all, but you need to tell it what you want to clone onto. So I've got this plane sitting here that's super big, and I'll just drop that in there, and right now it's going to clone onto the vertex, which is probably too orderly for what we want, but you can see it's already handling this with ease. We've got a ton of buildings there, so instead of vertex, let's set it to the surface, and now we've got way more buildings, and from here I can totally up the count and go crazy. So say we want 10,000. Now we've got this super dense city. Now the issue here is that it looks so orderly, and I'm going to make this a little bit easier to see just by coming in here and boosting this RGB spectrum a little bit so we can see what's going on a little bit better, and maybe messing with the gamma so that we can kind of see this scene a little more contrasty, and maybe make it a little less magenta because that bugs me. There we go. And up the exposure a little bit. Okay, that looks a little more normal for me. Still really flat, but you can see what's going on. So again, it looks really orderly. Now we can do something like add in a random effector. So effectors will totally work with Octane Scatter, which is great. So I can go to MoGraph Effector Random. Now, one caveat is that if you have scatter selected and you select your random effector like you'd expect with a cloner, it won't actually add that to the effectors list. So you have to do that manually. So I'll add in my random effector, and you'll see that they'll all get bumped in position, though we don't want that since they're already randomly distributed on this plane. But rotation would help. So what if we do 360 on the banking? Okay, that's the wrong one, obviously, though that's a cool look in and of itself. But you can see how fast scatter is going. So 360 on looks like the heading here will get a more randomized looking city, which is awesome. Now, what if we want them to have random scale as well? Let's try that. Let's do uniform scale, and then let's set this to say 1. No, that's going to make them giant. Let's do -0.5. Okay, so that's going to scale them up and down, but my issue with this is that when you come out really far, it looks complex, but it also looks orderly at the same time because there are no clumps. It's just kind of a randomized distribution of scale, but we're not seeing any dead zones or kind of any general structure. So it actually looks less random than you would want. So what you can actually do is go to your Octane Scatter here and come down to scale. And so there are also these fields for position, scale, and rotation in Octane Scatter itself. So here I could add a default Cinema4d Noise. So if I add in noise, you'll see what happens. Now we get these interesting kind of clumps. So instead of the default noise, let's try something like, I like electric a lot of the time, so let's try that. And then let's also do some low clip to get it to where they're just these islands, and then bring down high clip so we can kind of get our scale back. We can also increase the brightness overall, which will kind of bring it back. Okay, and I'm getting some cool results from FBM. Now we want to make sure that we bring back down the brightness. We want to make sure that we have some areas of black and some areas of white, because the areas of black will actually get us that those dead zones. And then potentially we could also increase the scale of the texture. So what if we go up to 500? Then we'll get these bigger kind of superstructures. So let's clip that down. So I don't think I should have used that brightness, but maybe the contrast value would actually get us more what we want. So if we boost that, then we've got kind of more of these islands going on. And then from there, we can go back to this overall shader and say up the scale of each of the buildings to 2 by 2 by 2. And so that'll bring back the buildings and get us this kind of crazy looking mega structure. Cool, so that's more the look that I'm going for. Okay, so now I want to make this look a little less gray and horrible. The first thing I'm going to do is just get rid of this scatter for a second, and I'm going to drop in this greeble texture that we made in our last class here. So I'll put that on the plane, and that's going to do a lot of work for us in terms of making this city believable. That already looks pretty cool. Okay, and then so we'll bring back the scatter, our city here. I'll let that load up. Okay, so cool. Now I'm going to do a little lighting and texturing. So if I go to options, check camera, then that will allow me to jump out of my camera without affecting my view here, but I can still light things and see updates live. So I'll just duplicate this camera for now and kind of come around here, and I'm going to drop in an Octane targeted area light and then set that target to the camera. So if I drop this camera in here, it'll be pointed towards the other camera. So if I come around here and back way up, I could set this area light as kind of a distant source. So we could set it all the way up here, and it's going to continuously point at the camera wherever I put it, which is useful. And then we could drop down our RGB spectrum in the environment down to something darker so we can see more of the influence of just the light there. So we're probably going to want this light to be a lot bigger. So something like that is catching along there. Okay, and you can see that this is getting pretty noisy down here. So this texture, if I go into the roughness, I've got this gradient that's pretty harsh, and then I've got this super grebe texture. So if I look at that, this is that Beeple texture, but this is causing all these harsh kind of patterns that might be breaking up those highlights and causing all of this noise. So I think I'm just going to clear that out. So if I clear that and then go up a level and actually get rid of this gradient as well, we'll just start fresh with the roughness. And so you can see if it's really low on the roughness, meaning it's really glossy, we get these intense highlights that are not doing us any favors. So let's bring that up until it's a little more rough, so the blurriness of the reflection increases, and now you'll see this is kind of a bit better of a look right here. So now we can kind of keep going on with lighting. So if I boost this light some more, you can see we're lighting up this big portion of our city. So that could be cool. Maybe we'll give it more of this orangey tint here in the temperature, and then I can duplicate this light and bring it on over to the other side here. So our camera is all the way down in here. We can bring this on over maybe to this side and catch some more highlights. Let's see, let's try bringing it on down. And an easy way to see it would be to change this one to a blue. And then we can boost the power as well until we see it picking up. And then I can't see anything there, so let's just turn this off until we're actually able to see this light. And then another thing I like to do is like really stretch out the light sometimes. And now we're seeing some stuff come in, though it's looking pretty noisy. So let's try over here. And maybe let's go higher up. There we go. So it was below the horizon, so that was a big issue. And now it's totally blasting the scene. So let's go in here and take the opacity all the way down so we don't see it at all. And then we can just drop the power of the light and probably also scale it down. And then again, I want it kind of more coming from the side, so we'll just kind of bring it around here until it's catching the side of these buildings, kind of like that. So let's combine those two, see what we get. Not liking the orange, so let's just make this like neutral. It's a little bit better. If I take down this RGB spectrum further, I should be able to get a more stark kind of look. And maybe we'll do a third light that's more of a front light. So let's duplicate this one here and just bring this one over towards the front. And up higher. And let's make it a little less long there. So that's helping some. And I can bring this down so that I don't want to overlight the scene. I don't want to see everything. So I can bring this light down until we're just adding a little more detail. So maybe something like 35. See how that looks. And maybe this one's not blue. This could be a little more neutral. And now I can go back and play with a little more with like the light temperatures maybe. So maybe one of these is kind of red. And maybe we power this one up to give it some intense light coming from another direction, kind of like that. And I took out the red light entirely because I think this is a little more mysterious and maybe more what I'm going for. All right, so let's bring back our RGB spectrum a little bit so we can kind of see what's going on a little bit better and cut off these lights temporarily. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to this kind of lighting context. I've got our lights set up pretty nicely where I want them, but I want to also look at textures and not just have these buildings be pure white. So what I can do is, let's start by creating a glossy material. And again, you can go under Materials, Octane Glossy Material. So I'll just put this on all of these buildings here together so I can click all of them, right click, and then go apply. And now if I start doing stuff in this one material, it should affect all the buildings. All right, so let's jump into this texture, and I want to create something metallic looking. So what I'll do is I'll take the diffuse almost down to black. I'll come to the index here, which is the index of refraction, and I'll boost this up to something like 5 or 7 or whatever, something a lot more reflective. And then I'll take my roughness up a little bit here. And that's looking kind of metallic. Now I want to pipe in a roughness map. Let's try this kind of grungy metallic texture here. See how that looks. And let's see what we're seeing. So you can kind of see that in there. Let me go compare, store render buffer, and then I'll clear that out and see what that's actually doing. So you can see that's adding in all this grunge here. So I kind of like that. So let's bring that back. So again, this one, and I'll just leave that at default. Now with the specular, say I want these to look more golden, I can take the specular up to a golden color, a little more orangey like this. That's way too much, so let's bring down the saturation of that. Maybe a little more towards orange here, a little brighter. It's kind of a bronze now. Bring it back. Cool, that works for me. Now, this is something interesting. So if I come into my Octane node editor, and I'll give myself a little more space so I can see what the heck I'm doing. And I'll say get active material. pull this open. Now, if I go to my specular, one interesting thing I could do is put in something called a random color and then put that in the specular. And you can see now we've got all these different colors for the specular in our scatter. So each building gets its own unique color. Now, if we want to take this further, we could put something called a Gaussian Spectrum in there. And what that'll do is it'll generate some random colors. And if I pull out if I pull the width down here, you'll see it'll get even more saturated to where we're getting all these crazy colors. And then if I want to kind of mix that back, say I like that where I'm getting some interesting colors, but if I want to mix it back, I can come back to the specular here and take this mix slider of this Gaussian spectrum down. So see, now we're blending back to that original golden color, but we've got some that are also slightly different. So it's got kind of a consistent golden vibe, but we're getting these different color variations in there too, which is pretty cool. And finally, maybe I'll put an image texture in here into our bump, and I can load in our friend Supergrebe and get some more detail going on. And then to actually see what we've done, I'll go to compare store render buffer and then detach this. And we should be able to see there's some extra lines coming up, but they look kind of, if I zoom in here, and I can just zoom in with the scroll wheel and it'll show me a little piece here. They look like they're not mapped properly because they're all skewed. So what I can do is, let's do compare store render buffer again. Let's reattach this. And then let's make sure that we're mapping this in a different way. So if I hit projection here and then get active material, that should actually show up as a texture projection node. And right now it's set to mesh UV. So we can override the UVs by going to box. And now hopefully you can see we're adding in additional detail, and I can make this big because you might not be able to see it. So we're adding in these additional little details and extrusions in the bump channel from that Supergrebe texture, and it's not kind of all warped out. So that's all good. Let's move on. I said that was the last thing, but the actual last thing I want to do is add in something into the diffuse channel as well. So I'll just go to image texture, and then here I can also pipe in our Supergrebe. Okay, and now again the mapping is totally wrong. It's a lot more clear here. It often helps, like if you want to test a texture, to load it into the diffuse. So again, projection, get active material, take this texture projection node and switch it to box. And that's adding in some interesting looking stuff here. And finally, I can take the power of this down so that we are only seeing it a little bit. So that's my cool building texture. Now I want to add some glowing blinky lights to the buildings. And only the diffuse material has the black body and texture emission channel. So I'll go over here to emission and I'll say black body emission. And then I'll put that on, say, one of my buildings here. And you can see now the buildings are glowing, but they're glowing all over the place. So that's getting closer, but it's not what we want. So let's come into this here and go into our black body emission. And here we can load a texture. So actually, I'll do this in the node editor because it makes more sense that way. So let's put an image texture into the texture slot of the black body emission. So let's come up here, image texture, and let's load this into texture. And it's making it even crazy brighter. But the texture that we want is this tiny dots here. So if I open this, this is another Beeple texture that you can get for free, or you can make something like this yourself in Illustrator like I showed you. So we'll take this guy in here, and this should allow us to only emit light from certain parts of this image. So let's bring this power down, and actually I'm just going to come in here so we can actually see one of these buildings a little bit better to see what's going on. And again, it's mapping improperly, so projection, get active material, and then let's take this to box. So there we go. Now we're getting these ordered lights on the buildings, which is really cool. It's too bright, so let's bring down, let's go back to our black body emission, let's bring down the power, and then let's make these lights pretty red. So that's cool, but we're losing our other texture behind it because this one's just overriding it. So what could we do here? We could do two things. The first one is create something called a mix material. So if we go under materials, it should be here, mix material, which just allows you to combine two materials like as a 50% slider or through use of a texture. So I can drop this on here, and then we can say what's material 1 and what's material 2. So with material 1 we want our emission, and then with material 2 we want that complex golden material that we created. So let's go back here and drop in our golden material, and now we should see, if I come in here, and there we go. If I take this slider down to 0, we'll have only the first material. If I take this slider all the way to 1, we'll have only the second material, but if I go somewhere in between, we'll be blending between the two. So that's pretty good, but maybe that's not the best way, though that's looking pretty close to what I would want. Another way could be, let's get rid of this mixed material entirely. Okay, and so say we wanted to not have to do that 50% blend. What if we took this image texture and also used it in the opacity slot, which is essentially the alpha channel? Then we would just get the lights sitting on top of the building. Now I was having issues with this earlier, and it was being unstable and showing me this building is completely transparent except for the lights. So instead of doing it this way, I'm actually going to do it inside the mix material. So if I go back to the mix material and I load this in, it looks like this. If I hit get active material, it looks like this crazy mess at the moment, but essentially this is here, down here is our black body material, and up here is our metal material, and it's being mixed by this float slider at half value. So basically 50% one material and 50% the other, just like we did before. So instead of this float texture here, which just means a black and white texture, what if we use this just like we did in the opacity slot, our texture here, our dot pattern, we can use this as the amount. So that effectively does the exact same thing and is a little more stable, where the lights are only showing up in the light parts of this image. I'll show you this image again. So the lights are only showing up in the light parts of this image. It's essentially using it as an alpha in the mix material, but not using it in the opacity slot. We're using it in the amount for the mix material. Sorry if that's a little bit complex to understand. Let me know if that made sense in the comments. I'm going to move on to getting these lights to blink. Okay, I lied. There's one little extra tip I wanted to show you. So if I come back to my black body emission texture, the thing creating the lights, and I want to change the color of the lights a little bit, obviously I showed you that I can do this with the temperature slider, and right now we're getting different colors in here because the original material, if I look at it, has some that are these different colors. So it's emitting those colors of light, and that will be most true when it's at the default value, which I think if I reset it will be 6500. Yep, so that'll reflect the original texture right there where we've got some blue and some red lights. But if I want to change around, say I make it more red, but I don't want these kind of green lights here, what I could do is I could put a color correction node in between the image texture and the black body emission. So with this color correction node, I could take down the saturation and essentially make this texture black and white, and they would all match. Or maybe I don't take down the saturation and I just mess with the hue. And so that's just going to affect those colored lights because that's the only part of the image that has any color in it. The rest is just white. So I could actually go into this black body emission here and set the temperature to be, say, something like this 12,000 Kelvin to be blue, and then mess around with the hue because the Kelvin stuff is only going to affect the white lights, whereas this color correct node, if I change the hue, it's going to affect these colored lights. So that's kind of cool. So I think this to be a little orange and then this to be super orange. So I kind of like that look. And then another thing I can do is I can take this material and duplicate it and then kind of place it on several more of these here. So say I select these buildings here randomly, and then I right click and I apply this version of the texture. Maybe I want this one to be a different color. So let's go to the emission and make it kind of more of a blue. And then hopefully some of these other buildings will show different colors of light. And of course I messed up because I put the black body on here instead of the mixed texture. So this gets a little more complex. So what's going on is I put the black body on here, but I actually needed to put the mixed material on there. So let's actually undo what I just did. And we've got a new black body, but we need a new mixed material. So I'll duplicate this mixed material as well. And this one I'll replace with the new black body. So let's do that. And then now if I select some random buildings, I can apply this here. Cool. And then finally I should be able to go to my new black body emission here. And there we go. Now we're seeing some blue lights and some orange lights. And maybe that one's too powerful, so we can come into this black body emission and bring it down to where those bluer lights are only showing up a little bit, and then we're really seeing the orange ones a little bit more. Okay, let's go back for a second and look at my original renders. So I made all these cities blink, and I'm going to quickly show you how to do that, though we're not actually going to do it in the scene because it's just going to take a little bit too much time to even see a result because the scene is getting pretty heavy. So I'm just going to show you a quick demo here. Okay, so I've just got these cubes here with a black body emission texture sitting on one of them, and I used Grayscale Gorilla's Signal to actually do this flickering animation. So Signal has a script built in under Script, User Scripts, Signal Scripts, presets called Flicker. And so if I play back and go to the output here, you can see it flickering in this kind of bzz, bzz, bzz kind of animation that we would expect from a flickering light. So we want to drive this power down like this, right? So if I link this power into the signal tag, I can just drag it. And then if I play back, you should see something happening a little bit, though it's tricky to see. So what we can do is we can up the strength of our main noise here to something like 333, and our subtle noise we could take to 33 to just boost those values. And now it should be a little more apparent. There we go. We can actually see that flicker. Now we can make this even more extreme. If we look at the output here, you can see that it's never really slamming down to 0 because our final output here is 1100, but in our main noise, our variation is only 645. So say we take this up to, I don't know, 1200. Okay, now when I play back, there we go. Now we can see it slamming down to 0 on occasion. So this is basically what we want. Okay, so at this point, we want to create 3 more copies of this texture. So I'll duplicate this 3 times, and I'll add each one of these to its own unique cube. And this is exactly what you would do with the buildings. You would create multiple black body emission textures and add each one to a unique building so that they're all flickering differently. And then what you want to do is you want to go in and go back to your user scripts, signal scripts, presets, flicker, and we'll create 3 blank tags because this one is already linked to the power and it's difficult to unlink it. I don't actually know how to unlink it once it's linked. So here we can go back to our black body emission and link these up 1 to 1. So I can go this one's power into this one, and let's switch the order of this just so it makes sense. And then we can go this black body emissions power into this one, and this black body emissions power into this one. So they're all linked up like that. And now when I play back, they should all flicker, though this one's the one with the stronger values. So let's get these values to all mimic each other. So on these 3, we had 333 here, and we had 1200 for the variation. And then for the subtle noise, which is just a second layer of noise, we had 33. So theoretically now they will all flicker, and they're actually doing it in sync. So what we can do is, the reason they're all in sync is because they all have the same seed. So if we come here and select all the tags at once and select the seed and type in NUM, that will pull the object's index. So this one's index is 1, this cube's index is 2, 3, etc. So they'll all get a unique seed. So this one is seed is 0, 1, 2, 3. So there you go. Now if I play back, you should see that they, see that's the issue, is that I had subtle noise selected. So if I come back to the main noise and do the same thing, come to that and go num, now if I play back, we should see these all flickering at different rates. So that's essentially the process for creating those randomized flickers. All right, let's come back into our city and turn on our lights again. So let's take our RGB spectrum back down to black. So now we should see nothing but these lights. And then let's cut our main lights back on. And that looks a lot cooler, I think. Now, interestingly, I can actually use this RGB spectrum a little bit as a fill light. So if I bring this back up to some kind of gray value, that'll actually bring in some additional kind of fill. So let me show you that real quick. So if I go back to 0, and I'll let this refine for a second. Right about there is good. So I can go compare, store render buffer. And then I'll bring this up to, I don't know, 20%. And then I'll let that refine as well. You can see what that's bringing in. It's bringing in a little bit of fill in here and also making the sky look a little more interesting, like there's some bloom happening in the background. So I definitely think that look is dramatic and cool. So the next thing to do is finally bring in this fog that I've been talking about. So there are two ways to create volumetrics in Octane. The first one is called the environment medium, or the environment fog. And so in any environment tag on an HDRI or on the daylight system or on this texture environment, we've got this medium tab. So if we go to medium, we can just click add fog and everything goes away. So the first thing you want to do is jump into this scattering medium and bring the density all the way down. And I learned this from another YouTube artist called John Burdock. He had all these values that I'd never seen before that were really helpful. So he actually took the density all the way down to 0.001. And real quick, let's go look at his YouTube channel just because I want to give him a shout out. So this tutorial specifically, how to project an image with lights in Octane and Cinema4d. You should definitely check this out. He shows how to get this really cool projector look. And I just kind of borrowed the values he punched in for the fog to get these light rays. So I set this to 0.001 on the density. And from there, you want to add a white color to the absorption. So I can just go Cinema4d Octane. I'll do a float texture, which is just a black and white. So I'll set this up to 1, which is white. And then I'll actually just take this and drop this into the scattering as well. So they're both white. And now we can jump up a level and mess with the thickness. So if I bring this thickness up, you can see at some point we start getting this awesome fog coming in. And let's just keep going until we see a change. So maybe at this point here, there we go. So I'm looking for when I can see a difference between the foreground, which is really dark, and then the background, which falls off into this foggy kind of zone here. So this is exactly what we're looking for. So it's really about playing with this thickness and then also playing with the density. So playing with the density may actually allow you to obscure the far background a little bit better. So let's see if we can get it to where we're not seeing these buildings in the background. So let's go compare, store render buffer, just so we can kind of remember this state. And then we'll move this out of the way for the time being. Now, if it gets too dark, we can always increase the power of the lights to compensate. So there's a bunch of things that we can do. But for now, let's up the density until it's crazy. And volume step length in this environment doesn't do anything from what I can tell. But later when we get to actual clouds, it definitely has a huge impact. But here we don't need to worry about the volume step length. And then we can pull down on thickness. And there we go. Now we're really obscuring those background buildings a lot more. So a final control that could be helpful in certain circumstances is if you go to the scattering, you can actually boost this value above 1. So say we made this 2, everything's going to get a lot darker. So maybe we could compensate by adding more light. So maybe let's add a little more light here. There we go. And then we could take down either the thickness or the density. Now, as to the difference between the thickness, the density, and adding more in the scattering medium, don't ask me. I just play with the values until it looks good. I have no clue the science behind all of this. It's pretty hard to understand. Another interesting thing is if I actually add in an RGB spectrum instead of the float texture here for absorption, then I can change the color of the fog to something totally different, like cyan or green or, I don't know, purple. And the same thing goes with the scattering, and you can get some pretty funky effects doing that. So if I added in an RGB spectrum here, maybe I change this one to a different color, and then because I lost my greater than 1 value, this has taken down the amount of smoke. So I'll just come back here and add in some more density. And there you go. Now we can get some really weird looking stuff going on. I'm going to go back to where we were because I kind of liked this look here. All right, and the last control I want to talk about is phase, which unlike density and thickness is a control that I actually understand. So phase affects how the light is passing through the fog, whether it's getting directed more towards the camera or more towards the light sources. At least I think that's what's going on. So if I go compare store render buffer here and I increase the phase, you'll see that I get this really interesting look that really brings out wherever the lights are. So if this light is up here and I really ramp up the phase, you can see now we've got this like intense cluster around the light source, which could be a super cool look, like really dramatic and awesome. I'm not going to push it that far because I think it's a little bit extreme, but say I go somewhere like this, then it's almost like I've got this floating ball of light here that's affecting the entire scene, which I think is really, really cool. And finally, maybe I want to change the composition and get more of a long lens look. So I could just right click and zoom way in and change my focal length dynamically here to something much longer, which will really compress the buildings. And maybe I back up here and get close to, I want some buildings in the really near foreground so that I've got this kind of like stacked depth here. So something like that maybe. And then if I right click and hold down 3, I can kind of rotate my camera on the banking. So maybe something like that. Now at this point, I think I want a little shallow depth of field. So I can come in and boost my aperture a little bit. And you can hold down Control and middle click to pick focus, or you can use this. So I could get this in focus here and have this out, or vice versa. So I'll try to get a little closer to here. There we go. Something like that could be interesting. But you can see if you do this kind of dolly move, so I just animate it from the start here to the end, and I just kind of reveal, add a keyframe here, and I'll also make sure that this is all linear, so I'll change these to linear. But you can see how cool it would be to reveal the city with this kind of tracking move, to have these kind of foreground buildings crossing the frame. I think it's a cool look. All right, so now I'm going to show you the other method of creating volumetrics, which is actually creating clouds using the fog volume. So right now so what I can do is I can just duplicate my sky here, and in this one I'll remove the scattering medium under the medium tab. So now I can just turn this top one off, and remember Octane will read the top environment first, so I can just switch this on and off. If I want my fog, I can turn it on, or if I don't want my fog, I can turn this off. So I want to put in a fog volume that's under Objects, Octane Fog Volume, and you'll see that this little box has appeared in the center of the scene, and I'm going to take it and drag it over towards my camera until we're able to see it. I'll rotate it into place, and I might have to reload the scene, and then I'll just kind of position it up into place here until we can see it. And there we go. Now we can see this box. I'm going to turn back off check camera and pop back up here. Okay, so this is an actual volume object. Essentially, it's like subsurface scattering. It's basically a subsurface scattering box, but it can be controlled by a noise. So if you come in here, the easiest way to set it up is to click on this cloud one, and that will load a default Cinema4d noise in here. It starts with Naki, And Naki's pretty good, and you can try any of these noises that you like. You'll get some really interesting, crazy results. I typically gravitate towards electric for whatever reason. I feel like it makes nice looking clouds. And so what's going on here is we've actually got a box of voxels, which are three-dimensional pixels, and you can kind of see them here in the viewport. They're represented as little squares, and it's easier to see if I come back to my volume object here and go to my, if I jump up here and go to my generate tab, and then increase the voxels. As you increase them, this is actually making it easier for Octane to process. It's taking less VRAM, and you can actually see the individual kind of boxes that are represented here. So as you bring it down, we're actually getting more and more dense and more detail along the edge of these clouds. But it's also much more likely to crash your computer. The other thing that will crash your computer is if you scale this box up too much, you'll notice that the noise actually stays in place and we're adding more and more voxels, and it's getting slower and slower. So if I wanted to encapsulate this whole scene in a box, right here it would be impossible with the amount of VRAM I have on my GPU. So what I would need to do is I would have to hit Control D and then go to my scene scale and do something like scale project down from 100 to 1, and then bring in a new volume, or cut and paste this same volume essentially. So that would make this bigger in reference to the scene, basically. So this is really dependent upon scene scale, but for my purposes here, I only need this small slice, and having a smaller box actually allows me to have much more detailed clouds within that small box. So I'm going to keep it as is and start to tweak it from here. So the first thing I can do is I can bump up the octaves, which will increase the detail in the noise. And then I can mess around with the global scale. If I want smaller clouds, I could go to something like 222 here. And we also have high and low clip, which are really important. If I bring up low clip, that will kind of crunch the noise down, so we'll have fewer clouds, which could be helpful. And then one of the biggest controls here is actually under the medium, and then we jump in the volume medium, we've got volume step length. In this case, it does a lot. So if I bring this down to 1, you should see the clouds super beef up, and you can actually go past 1 to get even more of an intense look. So that's really darkening the scene down. Now from here, maybe we don't need such high density. We could bring down the density and lighten things up a little bit, though I actually think I want to keep that density. And the other thing that I can do is in the absorption here, I can bring this a little bit brighter, and that brightens our clouds. And in the scattering as well, maybe I want this all the way to white, and that will further brighten things up. So if I take a screenshot here, so if I go compare store render buffer, and then come back to my generate tab and take these voxels down to say 2, we should see a major increase in detail. So let's wait for this to refine a little bit. And you should be able to see we're seeing a much more defined outline. We're seeing much more of the noise pattern in there. It's not kind of so boxy. And another really great control is this Voxel Multiplier, which has in parentheses render. So this will actually give you more detail in the clouds upon render time. It doesn't work in the live viewer here. It only works when you send to picture viewer. So if I were to increase this to 2, essentially nothing would bog down here. You wouldn't really see any change in the live viewer. But as soon as we go to the picture viewer, we'll get even more detail out of the clouds, which can be super helpful to kind of bypass the choke point, which is really cinema and its viewport. Okay, and finally I'm going to make these clouds even more dense to show you one more little feature here. So if I make these really thick and really detailed like this, you'll notice the difference in the absorption and scattering a little bit better. So if I change the absorption here, say I make it brighter, you'll see that the absorption is kind of the body of the cloud. So blue on the inside, and then maybe I want the scattering, which is kind of, you'll notice that more where light is passing through because they're less thick. So say I wanted that to be pink. Let's go in here and mess around with this until we get a really pink color. And you can see now we've got kind of blue at the core and pink at the edges. And as we pull down on the density now, you'll see these clouds become really semi-transparent. So say I bring it down to 10. This is a pretty unique, interesting look of its own. And finally, I want to show you that we can still combine both systems. So maybe I will make these clouds a little more sparse and then increase the size of them. Let's go for 1222 here. And then let's bring back our absorption back to white. And same thing with our scattering. And in this case, actually, it looks like we want the absorption a little bit darker. And then I can kind of, I think I'll make this a little less crazy on the volume step length. And maybe even more dense. So something like that might be cool. And now I can actually combine the two systems. If I turn this old Octane Sky back on, you can see that we've got both the fog volume sitting here and our environment fog. Okay, and I just brought the camera wide and got this result, so you can get some really cool looks combining these two systems. Alright, one last quick note is that you can actually animate these clouds using the animation speed parameter, and you can see I've been playing around with this for a future tutorial, though it looks kind of wonky because it's animating the noise, and so clouds will kind of spawn out of nowhere. It doesn't necessarily move how you'd expect clouds to. So say I set this to 0, set a keyframe, came forward, and then set this to 1. This would totally work. It makes no sense that you have to do this, but the issue is that it would accelerate into that and get faster and faster. So the way I do this when I want to actually have animation in the volume, the same thing works, by the way, in Octane Scatter. If you were to put a noise in the scale, for instance, and you wanted to keyframe this, it's the same deal. So I would start it, say I wanted it close to 1. I would go to the beginning, set a keyframe at 1, go to the end, and set a keyframe at 1.01. And that way, as we play back, you can see that it's animating at a consistent speed. So it makes no sense that you would have to keyframe this parameter, but there you go. And finally, if you want to render an alien abduction in your scene, you should check out the Brograph Luminous plugin. My Brograph buddies actually created a plugin for Octane, so kind of a plugin for a plugin. But what it does is it creates spotlights in Octane, which Octane cannot do by default. And it has all sorts of interesting controls like custom gobos that you can load in, fall off to get some kind of feathered edges, targets, cone widths, all sorts of stuff in there. So really good plugin that they made. And today we're offering a discount for people who watch this tutorial. So if you want to get a 20% discount on the Brograph plugin, type in lights20 into the promo code. So that's lights20. Alright, so we learned a ton of stuff today in Octane, from scatter to volumetrics to creating a sci-fi futuristic city, some texturing, lighting, all that good stuff. And again, if you want that plugin for 20% off, the Brograph Luminous plugin, type in lights20 into the promo code. Alright guys, see you next time.